In 1858, during the construction of London's modern sewer system, workers discovered something that shouldn't exist. Embedded in brick chambers dating to the 1820s were mechanical devices unlike anything in the historical record. These weren't pumps, they weren't steam engines, they were atmospheric motors, machines designed to extract energy from air pressure differentials. And according to our accepted timeline of technological development, they were impossible. But here's what makes this discovery truly unsettling. Within months of their documentation, every single unit was cemented over, buried beneath tons of Victorian engineering, and systematically erased from official records. The only reason we know they existed at all is because one junior engineer kept unauthorized sketches in his personal journal, sketches that wouldn't surface until his estate was auctioned in 1947. For most people, this sounds like an obscure footnote in industrial history, a curiosity. But when you understand what these devices actually were, when you see the pattern of suppression that follows every rediscovery, you start to realize this isn't about sewers or Victorian engineering. This is about a technology so fundamentally disruptive that someone decided it could never be allowed to exist in public consciousness. And the evidence suggests that decision was made at the highest levels of power. Today, we're going beneath London, not the London of tourist maps and historical plaques, but the London that exists in sealed municipal archives, in water authority basements, and in the private collections of families whose ancestors worked on projects they were forbidden to discuss. What we find there challenges everything we've been taught about the progression of technology, the nature of the Industrial Revolution, and the true capabilities of the civilization that came before. Because these atmospheric motors weren't experimental prototypes. They were fully functional installations that had been operating continuously since the 1820s, 30 years before anyone was supposed to have the engineering knowledge to build them. The official story is simple. London's sewers were a triumph of Victorian innovation, designed by Joseph Bazalgette in response to the Great Stink of 1858. But here's where it gets strange. Bazalgette's plans required the demolition of older infrastructure, and that older infrastructure shouldn't have been there. The maps show empty earth where workers found engineered chambers. The records describe manual pumping stations where they discovered automated systems. And most tellingly, the budgets include massive line items for structural modifications to pre-existing installations that officially didn't exist. Worker testimonies from 1858 to 1862 describe the same scenario repeating across different excavation sites. They'd break through to a sealed chamber, find it bone dry despite being below the water table, and discover brass and copper machinery still humming with movement, not powered by coal, not driven by external engines, but operating on principles the workers couldn't identify. Site foremen would document the finds, engineers would be called in to examine them, and within days, demolition orders would arrive from the Metropolitan Board of Works. Not salvage orders, demolition orders. These devices weren't to be studied or repurposed. They were to be destroyed in place and buried under concrete. Thomas Wickham was a junior surveyor working on the Southwark section in 1859. His journal entries are maddeningly detailed. On May 12th, he describes entering a chamber beneath Borough Market that contained 6 cylindrical mechanisms of unknown function, each approximately 8 feet in height, constructed of materials showing no corrosion despite evident age. He sketches them meticulously, copper cylinders with spiral internal channels connected to collecting chambers at the bottom and exhaust vents at the top. No fuel source, no external power, just atmospheric pressure differentials driving continuous motion that, by Wickham's calculation, could generate approximately 12 horsepower per unit. But here's what stopped Wickham cold. When he examined the installation date stamped into the brass fixtures, it read 1823. And when he reviewed the historical records for that location, they showed nothing but empty land until the area was developed in the 1840s. Someone had built an advanced pumping station in a location that officially didn't exist yet, using technology that officially hadn't been invented yet, for a purpose that made no sense in the historical narrative. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Every excavation site that encountered pre-existing chambers reported the same findings: advanced atmospheric motors. Dates in the 1820s, no documentation, and immediate burial orders. If you're thinking this sounds like standard protocol for unsafe or obsolete equipment, consider this. The demolition orders came from the Metropolitan Board of Works, but they were signed by officials who had no authority over sewer construction. Treasury officials, Home Office representatives, even members of Parliament with no connection to infrastructure projects. Someone very powerful wanted these motors gone, and they wanted the evidence buried so thoroughly that future generations would never ask questions. Now, if this investigation is making you question what else might be hidden beneath our cities, you're exactly where you need to be. Make sure you're subscribed because we're building a comprehensive archive of suppressed technology and erased infrastructure. This channel exists because the official narrative has holes you could drive a locomotive through, and every week we're documenting another one. Hit that subscribe button and the notification bell because what we uncover next makes the atmospheric motors look like the tip of an iceberg. The technology itself deserves closer examination. Atmospheric motors operate on a principle that seems simple but requires sophisticated engineering. They exploit the pressure differential between different atmospheric conditions, temperature, humidity, altitude variations, to drive mechanical motion. The basic concept was understood in the early 1700s, but creating a functioning, continuously operating motor required metallurgical precision that the official timeline says wasn't available until the late 1800s. The copper had to be alloyed with specific ratios of tin and zinc to prevent corrosion while maintaining conductivity. The internal channels had to be machined to tolerances of less than a millimeter. The valve systems required spring mechanisms with precise tension characteristics. Wickham's sketches show all of this. His notes describe finding manufacture marks suggesting casting techniques of unusual refinement and interior channels polished to a mirror finish, implying mechanical precision beyond current standard. He even attempted to measure the device's output, recording pressure readings and calculating work capacity. His conclusion: these units demonstrate engineering sophistication exceeding our present capabilities, yet their installation date predates any known development in atmospheric motor technology by at minimum 3 decades. And then comes the smoking gun. Wickham writes that when his supervisor examined the motors, he immediately ordered the chamber sealed and sent an urgent dispatch to the Board of Works. Within 48 hours, a team arrived from the Royal Society, not sewer engineers, but members of the scientific establishment. They spent 6 hours examining the installation, took detailed notes, removed several small components, and then gave the order, "Fill it, tonight, make it inaccessible." Wickham's journal captures his confusion. "I inquired as to the reason for such haste, given the potential scientific value of studying these mechanisms further. I was informed in unmistakable terms that the installations were not of current concern, and that my detailed documentation was to be surrendered to the board immediately. When I asked if the devices would be preserved for future study, I was told they had already been studied sufficiently and that continued exposure serves no purpose." Translation: someone had already examined these motors, had already understood their implications, and had already decided they posed a threat significant enough to warrant systematic destruction. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. This wasn't about safety. It wasn't about outdated technology. This was about control. These atmospheric motors represented a technology that could operate indefinitely without fuel, without external power sources, using nothing but the natural pressure variations in the atmosphere. They were self-sustaining energy systems. And in an era when Britain's power structure was entirely built on controlling coal mines, steam technology, and industrial fuel sources, a device that could generate power from air itself was an existential threat to the entire economic order. The evidence cascade continues. Wickham wasn't the only one documenting these finds. At least 7 other workers left records, though most were less detailed, and many were discovered only decades later. James Hartley, a foreman in Westminster, wrote letters to his brother describing curious engines beneath Parliament Square of a design no man present could identify. Sarah Pembroke, who worked in the administrative offices of the Board of Works, kept copies of demolition orders that specifically mentioned atmospheric apparatus requiring immediate interment. Even Joseph Bazalgette himself, in private correspondence from 1861, references complications arising from prior installations of unclear origin. But here's where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Every single person who documented these motors either died within the decade, had their papers destroyed, or disappeared from the historical record entirely. Wickham died in a warehouse fire in 1864, a fire that consumed only the building where he stored his personal effects, leaving adjacent structures untouched. Hartley emigrated to Australia in 1863 and was never heard from again. Pembroke's employment records show her dismissed in 1860 for gross misconduct, though no details of the misconduct exist, and the Royal Society members who examined the Borough Market installation, their names were redacted from the Board of Works documentation, and attempts to cross-reference them with Royal Society membership rolls of that period yield nothing. The silence is deafening. For an era that documented everything, that kept meticulous records of every brick laid, every contract signed, every penny spent, the sudden absence of documentation around these atmospheric motors is statistically impossible unless it's deliberate. And it's not just absence, it's contradiction. The official records actively conflict with the physical evidence. The chambers that contain these motors show construction techniques that don't match Victorian engineering. The brickwork uses a bonding pattern that wasn't standardized until the 1830s, yet includes materials analysis shows lime mortars consistent with 1820s formulations. The floor levels don't align with Victorian sewer depths. They're deeper, more precisely leveled, and oriented according to angles that serve no purpose in the official sewer system design. It's as if these chambers existed first, and the Victorian sewers were built around them, carefully avoiding or incorporating them while pretending they'd never been there. Modern researchers who've attempted to access these sites hit walls. Literally. The London Water Authority maintains that all pre-Bazalgette infrastructure was completely demolished during the 1860s construction. Yet when engineering surveys are conducted using ground-penetrating radar, they consistently show void spaces at depths and locations that match Wickham's maps. These voids are dismissed as natural geological formations, or incomplete historical fill, despite showing regular geometric patterns inconsistent with natural cavities. In 2003, a utility crew accidentally broke through to one of these chambers during cable installation near Tower Bridge. They reported a brick-lined vault approximately 20 feet square, bone dry, containing fragments of metal machinery showing extensive corrosion. The site was immediately secured by Transport for London, examined by specialists who arrived within hours, and filled with concrete before any independent documentation could occur. The utility crew's report was classified under critical infrastructure security, and the workers were required to sign non-disclosure agreements. A similar incident occurred in 2011 near King's Cross, another in 2017 beneath Whitehall. Each time the same pattern: accidental discovery, immediate lockdown, rapid burial, classified documentation, and each time the fragments reportedly recovered match Wickham's descriptions of atmospheric motor components. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Someone is still actively suppressing evidence of these installations, more than 150 years after their supposed demolition, which raises the question that haunts this entire investigation. What are they protecting? What could possibly justify this level of sustained concealment across multiple governments, multiple agencies, multiple generations? The answer becomes clearer when you understand what atmospheric motors represented technologically. These weren't just clever Victorian inventions. They were the culmination of a completely different approach to energy extraction, one that didn't require combustion, didn't require fuel, and didn't require the massive industrial infrastructure that defined 19th century power. They represented technological independence at the individual and community level, and that independence was incompatible with the centralized industrial system that Britain's elite were building. Consider the timing. The 1820s were the height of Britain's coal boom. The aristocracy and industrialists who controlled coal rights were accumulating unprecedented wealth and power. The entire British Empire ran on coal, powering factories, shipping, railways, the machinery of global dominance. Then imagine atmospheric motors becoming widespread. Imagine every building, every factory, every home equipped with devices that could generate mechanical power indefinitely using nothing but air. The entire coal-based economy would collapse. The power structure would shatter. The class system built on controlling energy resources would become irrelevant. From that perspective, the suppression makes perfect sense. These motors weren't hidden because they didn't work. They were hidden because they worked too well. They were hidden because their very existence threatened to make the ruling class obsolete. And here's where it gets even stranger. The installation dates of 1823 mean these motors were deployed during the exact period when official history tells us Britain was still figuring out basic steam engine efficiency. James Watt's improvements to steam power dated to the 1770s, 1780s, and atmospheric engine design was supposedly in its infancy. Yet here were fully functional, sophisticated atmospheric motors operating decades before they should have been possible, which means either our timeline of technological development is completely wrong or someone else built them. This is where we need to talk about the architectural evidence, because the chambers containing these motors don't look Victorian. They don't even look like they were built by the same civilization. The brickwork shows a level of precision that wasn't standard in British construction until much later. The dimensions use measurements that don't correspond to any British standard of the 1820s. And most tellingly, several chambers show evidence of having been sealed and then reopened multiple times over long periods, suggesting they existed for decades or even centuries before the Victorian era, maintained by groups who understood their purpose. Wickham notes this explicitly. He writes that several chambers showed evidence of repeated maintenance, with tool marks of varying age suggesting continuous access over extended duration. He found brass fittings with manufacturing marks he couldn't identify, using symbols that didn't match any known British foundry. He discovered mortar repairs using techniques he described as superior to present methods in both material composition and application precision. Someone built these chambers, someone installed these motors, someone maintained them for decades, and that someone operated completely outside the official historical record, leaving behind infrastructure so advanced that when Victorian engineers finally encountered it, the only response was to bury it and pretend it never existed. Now, if you're starting to sense that this connects to a larger pattern of suppressed infrastructure and erased civilization, you're absolutely right. The atmospheric motors are just one thread in a tapestry of evidence pointing toward advanced pre-Victorian technology throughout Europe. And we're documenting all of it. Make sure you're subscribed because over the coming weeks, we're examining water systems in Paris that predate official construction, power distribution networks in Berlin that nobody can explain, and thermal regulation systems in Moscow that still function despite being officially non-existent. Hit that subscribe button now because what we're uncovering is nothing less than the true technological history of the 1800s, the one they buried along with the evidence. The implications expand exponentially when you examine what else was happening in London during the 1820s. This was the era of massive urban renewal projects that demolished entire neighborhoods with minimal documentation. The official story is that these were slum clearances necessary to modernize the growing city, but the demolition records show something odd. They describe removing infrastructure that shouldn't have existed in slums, sophisticated water systems, underground chambers, structures built with materials and techniques that were supposedly unavailable to the working-class populations who lived there. It's the same pattern we see globally during this period. Paris underwent massive reconstruction under Haussmann, Berlin was restructured, Vienna was rebuilt, Moscow saw extensive modernization. In every case, the projects demolished older infrastructure that the historical record claims was primitive or non-existent. And in every case, the demolished areas contained underground installations that were sealed or destroyed without adequate documentation. The atmospheric motors in London weren't isolated. They were part of a network. Wickham's maps show the chambers he documented weren't random locations. They formed a grid pattern beneath the city, spaced at regular intervals, connected by channels that served no function in the Victorian sewer system. When you plot these locations on a modern map, they align with a geometric precision that suggests centralized planning and purpose. They weren't individual installations. They were nodes in a citywide power distribution system. And here's what makes the silence truly deafening. If Britain possessed this technology in the 1820s, where did it come from? Steam power was being refined through incremental improvements over decades. Railways emerged from mining transport systems. Telegraph technology evolved from electrical experiments. Every major Victorian innovation has a documented developmental history, except the atmospheric motors. They appear fully formed, perfectly functional, installed in chambers that predate their supposed invention, with no prototype phase, no experimental period, no gradual refinement. They simply existed, complete and operational. The only explanation that fits the evidence is that they weren't invented during the Victorian era at all. They were inherited. The Victorians discovered them, examined them, understood their implications, and made a collective decision to erase them from history rather than allow their existence to disrupt the coal-based economic system that was making Britain the dominant global power. This explains the Royal Society's involvement. This wasn't about sewage engineering. It was about protecting the technological paradigm that supported British supremacy. Those scientists who examined the Borough Market installation understood exactly what they were looking at. They recognized the threat. And they made the calculation that preserving the existing power structure required burying the truth, literally and figuratively. The suppression required coordination at multiple levels. The Board of Works had to issue demolition orders without explanation. The Royal Society had to examine the evidence and recommend destruction rather than study. Parliament had to authorize the expenditures without questioning the unusual line items. The workers had to be silenced through intimidation, financial incentive, or elimination. And the historical record had to be scrubbed systematically, removing references, destroying documents, and creating a narrative that made the atmospheric motors impossible to imagine. That level of coordination doesn't happen by accident. It requires planning, resources, and authority that extends across institutional boundaries. It requires a group with the power to compel cooperation from scientists, politicians, engineers, and administrators. It requires what we might call a conspiracy, except that word has been weaponized to make serious investigations seem ridiculous. So let's use precise language. This was coordinated suppression of technological evidence that threatened existing power structures, executed by elites with the means and motive to protect their economic interests, sustained across generations through institutional secrecy and historical revisionism. That's not conspiracy theory. That's documented historical pattern, and the evidence keeps emerging despite their best efforts. In 1947, when Wickham's estate was auctioned, his journal and sketches entered private hands. The family sold them to a collector of Victorian industrial memorabilia who had no idea what he was purchasing. Those documents sat in a private collection for 30 years before a researcher examining 19th century engineering practices stumbled across them. By that time, the immediate threat of exposure had passed. The people who might have testified were dead. The physical evidence was buried under modern London, and the official narrative was so firmly established that Wickham's account seemed like the fantasy of an overwrought imagination. Except it wasn't fantasy, because Wickham's sketches match the fragments recovered in 2003, 2011, and 2017. The dimensions align, the materials match, the manufacturing marks correspond. His descriptions of atmospheric pressure differentials driving continuous motion align with theoretical models that wouldn't be formally articulated until the late 20th century. He was documenting something real, something functional, something that worked. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Every accidental rediscovery confirms the historical accounts. Every attempt to access the sealed chambers hits official resistance. Every researcher who pursues this seriously finds their work dismissed as fringe speculation. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. The suppression is ongoing, active, and systematic. Which brings us to the question that defines this entire investigation. What else is buried beneath our cities? If London conceals an entire network of atmospheric motor installations, what other infrastructure has been erased? What other technologies were available to pre-Victorian civilization? And why is the establishment so desperate to prevent us from asking these questions? The atmospheric motors represent a single technology, but they point toward a comprehensive alternative energy system that would have fundamentally altered the trajectory of industrial development. Instead of coal-fired centralization, we could have had distributed atmospheric power. Instead of pollution and resource depletion, we could have had clean, perpetual energy extraction. Instead of empires built on controlling fuel sources, we could have had technological independence at the community level. Someone decided we couldn't have that. Someone decided the future would be built on combustion, extraction, and centralized control, and that someone had the power to bury the alternative so thoroughly that most people today have never heard of atmospheric motors, couldn't imagine they existed, and would dismiss the evidence as impossible. But here's what they couldn't bury. They couldn't erase the geological anomalies, those void spaces that ground-penetrating radar keeps detecting beneath London. They couldn't eliminate every document. Wickham's journal survived, along with fragments from other sources. They couldn't silence every witness. The 21st century utility workers who broke through to these chambers talked, even though they were pressured not to, and they couldn't suppress the fundamental questions their actions raise. Why would you demolish functional technology instead of studying it? Why would you bury evidence instead of preserving it? Why would you classify accidental discoveries of 19th century infrastructure as matters of national security? Why would you maintain this secrecy for over 150 years unless the implications remain threatening to current power structures? The silence is deafening, and it tells us everything we need to know. The official story doesn't add up. The gaps in documentation are too convenient. The pattern of suppression is too consistent, and the evidence that keeps emerging, despite every effort to contain it, confirms that London's sewers contain secrets that someone very powerful doesn't want examined. Now, if this investigation has you questioning what other infrastructure remains hidden beneath our feet, you're thinking exactly right. Next week, we're examining the Paris catacombs and the water channels that flow through spaces that officially don't exist. The week after, we're documenting the Berlin Underground, where construction crews keep finding chambers that predate the city's known history. This is bigger than London. This is bigger than atmospheric motors. This is about recognizing that the world beneath our cities contains a technological history that's been systematically erased, and we're bringing it to light one discovery at a time. Subscribe now, because what we uncover next will fundamentally alter your understanding of when advanced technology actually emerged in Europe. The atmospheric motors themselves weren't the endpoint. They were indicators of something larger, a civilization or group that possessed engineering knowledge far beyond what the historical record attributes to the early 1800s.